So welcome everybody. This is the noon meeting presentation for the Centre for Environmental and Occupational Health Research. And the topic today is really, it poses a question, what are we going to do about asbestos-containing materials in homes in South Africa? I think it's a very relevant thing. Ever so often I get a very panic-stricken person phoning me saying they've done a renovation and they've discovered asbestos in their home. What do they do? There's young kids around, and we've even had the same kind of thing coming from Parliament. So we are very, very fortunate to have Paul Whelan from the Western Cape Department of Infrastructure, formerly, I think, the Human Settlements Department. Paul is a policy researcher in the Western Cape Department of Infrastructure, and before that, he worked in the Western Cape Provincial Treasury and various NGOs within the urban sector network. And Paul is going to focus really on key points from the draft program on removal, disposal, and replacement of asbestos in homes. So very much a focus on government policy. And he's also going to show us examples of abatement projects. So I'm not going to spend a lot more time. I'll introduce Prof. Rees just before he starts his presentation. So I'm going to hand over to you, Paul.
Okay, great, thanks. I'm now going to try and share my presentation. Okay, so I mean, the first thing I want to say is that I'm not an expert in this at all. I'm sort of a general policy generalist on human settlement policy. I mean, this is actually a draft policy, so it hasn't actually been passed by the Human Settlements National Department, although they are doing abatement projects, which may or may not be in line with this policy. Because the information on the abatement projects is not very extensive. So I will try and cover them and raise issues as I go along. And just to say that why we're looking at this is really to sort of advocate to the National Department on what we think should go into the policy, how it should be changed, amended, what are important points that are missing, and what can be done to strengthen it. So, and then if that bears no fruit, then like the next question would be like, what do we do to manage it effectively in the Western Cape? So if you can have those questions at the back of your mind, I mean, that would help us a lot. Yeah, I wanted to say, I think that's what I want to say is for introduction. So the policy, I'm just going to try and outline the purpose of the policy and then some aspects of it, some of the key aspects of it. So, basically, it's a program that provides public funding for treatment and removal and disposal sort of asbestos, and actually the replacement of parts of the. So I'm getting feedback.
Sorry, the person who joined, can you just mute, please?
And funding the replacement of any roofs or covering that is replaced, that is removed, and it's targeted at basically all residential property that was built for ownership under an array of subsidy schemes going back to the dawn of time, like basically under apartheid and all that. There were all these schemes for building houses. A lot of them had asbestos materials. So it's those units that are covered. It excludes like stuff that was built for actual employees of the state and for rental accommodation, even government-owned rental accommodation. That will obviously have to be covered by other programs and other budgets. And then the intervention that it covers is the like it only covers the removal and disposal and replacement and encapsulation of like materials. Obviously, a lot of emphasis on roofs, but also can include walls. And then importantly, buried in the policy is it says that the removal is only in the case of like where there is friable building material and it's I don't know why it says and, but anyway, and in poor sort of condition, and you know, if it will break up further if disturbed, and encapsulation is only for the non-friable in good condition, and it has to be a roof, so they won't encapsulate the walls or whatever. It doesn't cover the encapsulation of walls. Then the policy, like within the policy, is a very sort of elaborate set of sort of contractual relations and responsibilities amongst the host of different professionals within. It's not clear whether some of them are within government, but you know they have a certain sort of registration status under professional bodies, and then some will be in private sort of contractors. So it's actually very confusing, sort of in the policy about. Well, I was very confused when I read it about the different roles and the relationship sort of between these different authorities and sort of entities. So I just want to say a few things about that. I mean, the first is that there should be a condition assessment, and that should be managed or done by a professional structural registered sort of engineer. And and that includes a whole lot of different parts to it, including like a prescription of precautionary measures for any of these site areas, involving a construction safety and health officer, I think, and a range of other things. So there's all that set of people, and then there's also something called an approved inspection authority, which seems to be in terms of the Occupational and Health Act, that is an independent sort of oversight body over the whole operations of like the sort of abatement operations, and they have to perform a lot of different tasks. So you can see, I mean, one of the questions that I have is there's has sufficient, I mean, you won't know the answer to this question, but just to give you a kind of indication of the nature of this policy. When I was reading it, I was wondering if sufficient attention has been given to the issue of sort of conflict of interest amongst all these different players. So, I mean, that'll become clearer when I look at some of the abatement projects, but I think that is a very important question we need to ask. I mean, all this stuff is infused by, all the regulations that relate to asbestos like abatement and asbestos works that's come out of the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and it's really kind of like infuses the policy, and it makes for very confusing policy and provisions. Okay, so then just moving to the next slide. In terms of the management of the program, unlike other programs in the other housing subsidy programs, which lay out in a lot of detail how they what is supplied by the program and the subsidy quantum, the amount of government funding that can go into providing the products that come out of the subsidy program. In this program, there's the departments in provinces, human settlements departments, have a lot of discretion. So one area of discretion that they might have, and this is not clear, is actually setting the funding sort of envelope for all the projects. If it's part of a bigger grant, like the main housing grant, or they might not have that. If it's part of if it's all sort of confined to a specific program with its own funding. So that's not very clear in the policy. And then the department also identifies projects, abatement projects, and appoints the contractors and decides on the project amount. So this is quite different from the way things work in other programs. And the cost depends on the local situation, and there's a whole set of parameters to sort of look at to determine the cost. And then in terms of implementation guidelines in the policy, there's a lot on procurement and reservations for small and medium sized enterprises, and also more stuff on the occupational health regulations around asbestos works and how they should be managed. Really a lot on that, and it also includes the roles and responsibilities of various spheres of government. I've mentioned provinces, municipalities also have a key role, especially on the disposal and the kind of enforcement of standards for like whatever replaces the removed asbestos. Okay. Then I thought it would be useful to look at what came out of the budget speech, and just this is an extract from the national budget speech. You can see the very sort of emotive language. Apartheid relic that still weighs heavily on the health of poor households. We must eradicate asbestos as a matter of priority. So that's, and then an amount of 22 million across provinces has been allocated. I mean, this is actually quite a small amount if you compare it to the size of the entire budget, but it may grow over time. And you can see the emphasis is on removing asbestos roofs. Okay, then I just want to look at 3 provinces. So this information is probably a little bit out of date. It was like we pulled these presentations from the Parliamentary Monitoring Group's website, from presentations that departments had given to the Portfolio Committee for Human Settlements. So you'll see there, I mean, if you analyze this a little bit, the unit costs for the intervention are kind of estimated to be, or budgeted to be, around 100,000 to about 80,000 per unit in KZN. They all seem to relate to roof replacement. Okay. Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to move the slide along. Not really succeeding very well. Okay, then I'm just looking at, I think this is Limpopo. Their project, I mean, they seem to have gotten a very large allocated budget that it seems to be wrong in their slide by the fact, by a naught sort of added onto it. But anyway, if you translate this, it's also a roof replacement. It can, like the cost can be is somewhere between 230,000 and 23,000 per unit. And they seem to say they can do it all in situ, which I guess means they won't have to move people far away from the actual structure while they remove the structure, remove the roof and put a new one on. Anyway, what's another interesting thing in this slide, I think somewhere, oh yeah, list of affected beneficiaries was obtained from the municipality. So it relies on a lot of information on where these units are, and the kind of projects that that are identified coming from the municipality, and that's a theme I want to. Let me just try and move on. There we go. I want to pick up on, and I mean, another thing that's coming out. I mean, basically, there seem to be two models. Like the one is a kind of bottom-up sort of model where they ask municipalities where provinces are asking municipalities to identify all their housing units across the entire municipality, which have asbestos sort of containing roofs or walls, and then sort of aggregating that. So that seems to be, and then identifying projects from that. And like another model would be to appoint a body like the Housing Development Agency, which is basically a kind of creature of the National Housing Department, to do sort of high-level assessments across the entire province, and then scope from that, and identify projects from that. I mean, how they do that it's not very clear. Okay, then this is in Mpumalanga. Also just the same approach, like quite a decentralized approach where municipalities are forwarding lists of asbestos-roofed houses. And then there's a creation of a database, and the project seems to come out of that. Exactly how that occurs is not very clear. Then we asked one province who remain unidentified about how they went about identifying projects, and what they say is this sort of like bottom-up approach. When municipality identifies projects, sends a request to the provincial departments, who appoint specialists to assess the roofing, and then the specialist is then responsible for removal and disposal. This obviously raises issues of conflict of interest. Okay, another thing that I did just to try and figure out sort of what the environments, the policy environment and the kind of abatement environment is like, is I asked the city of Cape Town, like, what are they doing in connection with asbestos disposal, and making that more accessible and affordable for citizens of Cape Town. So they weren't able to respond to me, but what I did find on their website was a pamphlet on dealing with hazardous waste. I think it's probably fairly typical of about how to clean asbestos, and then how to remove it, what to do, and where to dispose of it. Basically, it's one site in the city of Cape Town, which is Vissers Hoek. And then they also point out that for demolition and construction work, the legal requirement is to get registered contractors to remove and dispose. So that's, I thought, would be, important part of the kind of disposal and abatement, the abatement kind of ecosystem, if you like, that would be important to sort of look at. Then just in the Western Cape, we also last year did the department asked municipalities about where all their like if they had houses that like were old subsidy houses, etc., created through these programs with asbestos, where like how many they had. So this is the kind of sort of like frequency sort of distribution of the answers that we've got. Some municipalities have yet to answer, but you'll see that the total for the Western Cape so far, across most, if you look at most municipalities, is around about like 110,000 units, with the majority in the city of Cape Town, but then also quite a lot in Saldanha Bay and in the George area. Okay. Then the final slide are just some questions that I thought were important for the policy to understand those three questions. I mean, those two questions that I raised at the beginning. What do we need to advocate for how the policy should change to be more effective? And then, if we were stuck with this policy, how should we try and implement it in the most effective way? So the first kind of question we may need to look at is, what is the role of property owners of subsidy houses in asbestos abatement? Like what is the optimal role? I mean, obviously, this intervention is all about what the government is going to do to address the problem at huge cost. So we've already, in the order of 100,000 Rand per unit, possibly, which is about a half to a third of the actual cost of a new house. So it's at considerable cost if you do a sort of roof replacement. Then what types of abatement intervention should be publicly funded, versus for the cost of the resident or the owner of this property. Are encapsulation and replacement and disposal the only interventions that should be government funded? When we think about that, we also need to think about the kind of way that resources flow to beneficiaries and the sort of financial management around that. Things like leakage of the subsidy and how to manage that. I mean, there's stringent regulations around how these programs are designed to avoid things like subsidy leakage. Then just some other questions about when would you have to remove a roof? Is there are the guidelines in the policy sufficient? Are they appropriate? Do we need to give much more clarity on that? And the same for encapsulation. So I mean, those are the only two interventions that are funded so far in the policy. Then how do you actually, if you want to identify high risk areas that actually require definite prioritization, how would you go about doing that? I mean, the current policy seems to be a bit hit and miss. It's not very clear about how you would do that in a cost-effective where, I mean, what they're talking about extremely sort of elaborate surveys at to establish like the condition of houses, and like it's not clear you can do that on a provincial wide sort of basis, which then leads to the situation of this sort of bottom up approach where municipalities identify, and then through a kind of perhaps not a very rational process, those projects sort of get identified. And then another question would be how to lower the costs of removal and disposal. I mean, that's something you would think this policy would focus on, but it doesn't at all. Okay, thanks. That's my piece. Hopefully it's not too long. Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thank you, Paul. I am going to ask Prof. Rees to load his presentation. I'm not going to take questions now. If people do have questions, they're welcome to pose it in the chat, but we will have the question and answer session afterwards, a discussion after Prof. Rees's talk. Paul, can you stop sharing? So Prof. Rees, I think, is well known to all of us. He's an emeritus professor at Wits University and a research associate with the National Institute of Occupational Health. He's supposedly retired, but seems to be very actively working still. And Prof. Rees, I believe, did his PhD on mesothelioma, which is an asbestos-related cancer. And he raises a sort of interesting question in his presentation where he speaks about mesothelioma risk from the legacy of asbestos-containing materials versus serious public health issues such as failing sewage treatment plants. Over to you, David.
Sure, I'm trying to share, but it doesn't seem to be working. It's not giving me an option to. Let me try again. Oh, no.
David, would you like me to try and share? I might have it open on my side.
Yeah, if you could.
Okay, can you close that? Can you stop sharing and then I will try and share.
Okay.
You seem to have the team screen. Okay, let me see if I can share.
Aha. Okay, it's up.
It's up. Okay.
Not on the first slide though. So I guess you're gonna have to do
Yeah,
the slide.
you can just tell me.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, I don't think we need this one. We can go on. So Paul gave a very interesting presentation. I was quite fascinated by it, and there's a little bit of overlap between this and Paul's presentation, but I'll try and point that out. So I guess as a general comment, I think there's sort of a rush to remove these roofs, and I think the issue's become politicized. You know, it's framed in the context of apartheid era things, and of course it was an apartheid era strategy to build cheap housing far away from the cities. And asbestos cement was used preferentially, so I guess you could frame it like that, but it's important also to realize that this is a global problem. I was in Western Australia in Perth a few years ago, and they have possibly just as big a problem as in South Africa, because they had a big asbestos mine in Witwatersrand, a blue asbestos mine, and they used a lot of asbestos cement materials. So, I mean, it's a global problem. But anyway, so I suppose I'm saying that because I think politicizing it is a mistake. although I can understand why it's happening. But anyway, the big question to me is this: is the mesothelioma risk from legacy asbestos-containing materials a serious public health problem? Because we have to think of it in the context of limited resources and other serious public health issues. And Shahida mentioned, failing sewage treatment plants. I mean, the cholera epidemic is really topical and illustrative of this. I mean, there have been, I think, 24 deaths now that have been recorded. Where should money be directed is the question. Next slide, please. So this is just a picture of Soweto, and you can see in the foreground many houses with asbestos cement roofing sheets. I just want to make 2 points about it. These houses were largely constructed in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, so some time back. And NEDLAC commissioned a project estimated that there are about 1 million buildings in South Africa with asbestos-containing materials in them. So we have a serious legacy issue with asbestos-containing materials. There's no question about that. Next slide, please. And of course, there's also asbestos in schools. In Gauteng, there are 248 schools that contain asbestos cement materials, but 31 are predominantly asbestos cement materials. I must say, I don't know if would have liked my children or my grandchildren to go to a predominantly asbestos cement school. Next slide, please. And this is just to make the point that because these materials were largely put in place in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, they are weathering and they are deteriorating. They suggested to have a lifespan of 50 years. But that was just a guesstimate at the time of construction, and it doesn't mean that this 50 years is actually true. The point is, one can expect weathering, but to what extent it's actually happening is unknown, as far as I know. Next slide, please. Also, people do funny things with asbestos cement. You can see there's a piece of asbestos cement acting as a wind breaker. What's that thing called when you put something under the thing near the door to stop the wind coming in? And also this picture was taken during a study that Jim Phillips did, looking at asbestos cement in the soil around houses, under the roofs, because most of the houses don't have gutters. And they found asbestos fibers in the soil around all of the houses they looked at, 61 of them, but in not sufficient concentrations to present a health risk in their view. But obviously, if people dig around the houses and do gardening and stuff, they're going to be exposed to fibers. Next slide, please. So the question still remains, though. We've got a legacy problem. We can expect weathering eventually, if not now. And so one has to think about the issue very carefully. But in the context of other public health issues and other priorities around asbestos. So should we be spending a lot of money on roofs, especially? Next slide, please. So I have found only one study. Maybe some of you know of more recent ones, but I did do a search before this meeting and I couldn't find another one. So I've only found one study that looked at the risk of mesothelioma, which is the condition that we worried about. It's the only one to worry about with asbestos-containing materials. For people living under asbestos cement roofs. And the study was done in Italy by Ferrante in a very famous city, Casale Monferrato, because it had a very big asbestos cement plant and they have a lot of cases of mesothelioma. So if you look at that top row where the arrow is pointing, you'll see that they found an odds ratio, an increased risk of 2.5 for living under asbestos roof relative to those who didn't have exposure from other sources, which is quite a high risk. And that's adjusted for having worked or not in the asbestos cement factory. But there are a lot of limitations with this study. There's so much asbestos material in the city, or the town. I'm not sure if it's a big town or a city. And it's almost impossible to control for other sources of exposure, to my mind. So one can't dismiss this entirely, but I'm unpersuaded by this study. Next slide, please. Now, this is quite an important thing. This is a systematic review and meta-analysis of non-occupational asbestos exposure and mesothelioma. And they found a summary relative risk estimate of 1.73 for having had home exposure to asbestos from home improvements. You can see the confidence interval spans 1, but still there are small numbers. I mean, I think this is not statistically significant. I think it's a significant finding. And it's not only this kind of study, this was a meta-analysis, but there have been very persuasive findings from things like the Western Australian Mesothelioma Register, which has shown a risk of mesothelioma from do-it-yourself home improvement tasks where people have worked with asbestos-containing materials and asbestos cement materials. Next slide, please. So this is my summary of that. There's scant literature on the risk from asbestos cement roofs. And to my mind, the risk, and it's a risk of mesothelioma, is either small or trivial or non-existent. But working with household asbestos cement materials, do-it-yourself and home improvement products, that's likely to be a moderate risk and something to be taken seriously. Weighed against that, you've got to think about what happens when you remove these roofs. Unless it's done really carefully, it liberates fibers into the local and general environment. And as Paul said, it generates waste, and something has to be done about that. Next slide, please. So I just want to make a few suggestions about what we might think about doing. Bearing in mind that Paul mentioned quite a few things that people are thinking about. And it did make me think, but anyway, I think we do need a national long-term. This doesn't have to be done in a hurry because the risk hasn't been established, especially relative to other public health issues. A long-term and costed asbestos policy with priorities and options other than removal. Next slide, please. So thinking about a policy, I mean, Paul was talking about that an asbestos program. So there is some thought that's gone into it, and the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment is also in the process of putting a policy together, but that's really more on mining than residential asbestos-containing materials. But I just wanted to make this is an agency set up by the Australian government, the Asbestos Safety and Eradication Council, and it's to prioritise and coordinate and assist implementation of a national agreed to policy. And I think that's something we need, because as far as I can see, we don't have it. Paul and others might know better than me. Next slide, please. And this is around the issue of prioritization. Now, I don't know whether conditions like this are still common, but this shows environmental contamination by cricidolite blue asbestos in residential areas. And this definitely was the situation not so long ago. Jim Tabarton-O'Dear talks about this kind of exposure in schools in the Northern Cape. But I don't know to what extent this still exists. But this is the kind of thing that is a priority and needs urgent attention, because these fibers are not in a matrix, and they can be disturbed and they can be readily available for inhalation. Next slide, please. Another priority is the rehabilitation of contaminated mining areas. I got this slide from Herman Corneliussen, who was working at Mintec at the time, and he had quite a big role to play in this rehabilitation of waste sites. But this is a good example of the reason why it's a priority and urgent. This shows a mine in Hunningflay. It's been rehabilitated, but you can see a asbestos pollution pathway coming from the rehabilitation site, so it didn't work very effectively. And that pathway is leading directly to houses. Those little rectangles you can see next to that road, those are houses. So this is urgent and important. Next slide, please. Okay, so I said one should also consider options other than removal. This is a paper from Science of the Total Environment, April 2023. And it just considers some of the options other than removal. One of them is containment. So containment is encapsulation or coating. It's called encapsulation. And also isolation. So I'll give you an example. At the NIOH, we had a sort of open office, quite a big one, with asbestos-containing ceiling sheets. And they were in good shape, and they had been painted recently, and I didn't think it was a risk, but people were worried about working under it, which is fair enough. So we put in a false ceiling instead of removing the sheets, which was one option, which would have been expensive, especially given the disposal costs. So we put in a false ceiling. Stabilization is it's rather specialized and can't be done with in situ asbestos cement roofs, for instance. It's more for waste material. Inertization is very interesting. There's a lot of research being done on different ways of making the asbestos fibers non-toxic. So you can use a variety of means. There are biologic agents, bacteria and fungi, that are being looked at. You can destroy the asbestos, physical destruction, and you can also use chemicals and thermal methods to make the asbestos non-toxic. And quite a lot of thought and work is going into this. So I'm not an expert on this, and I can't say what the prospects are for them being entirely safe, but they certainly have to be considered in a policy. Next slide, please. So that's the long-term policy with priorities. Is a mesothelioma register with detailed exposure histories useful? So the idea of this would be to try and identify whether or not cases are arising from exclusively asbestos cement roofs, for instance. So they've got a register like this in Australia. In the different states have their own registers, but in Western Australia, the doctors notify the registry of cases, and then they have trained interviewers, usually nurses, who phone the cases and get a detailed exposure history. Of course, it's resource intensive, and although we did have a mesothelioma register some decades back, but one could focus on the non-occupational cases. So if there's an occupational history, don't worry about the case. Just report the ones who have don't have any occupational history. There's also the issue of latency, of course. I mean, by the time you get a case of mesothelioma, the exposure might have been 20, 30, 40 years ago. So it's not really, well, will the information be useful 30 years after the exposure occurred? Possibly. I'm not sure. I'm not sure about a register, but it's something to think about. Next one, please. The general public, and I suppose, well, more than the general public, but needs good, reliable information, especially about what not to do. what should you not do? And that's the do-it-yourself kind of issue. But information needs to be supported by resources, because if you give people information and then there's nothing they can do about it, that doesn't help. So I kind of think the resources that might be useful coming along with the information is subsidized encapsulation materials and information about how to apply them properly. Tools for self-assessment of asbestos-containing materials in dwellings. So the person who lives in the home would do their own assessment. And tools have been developed for this. There's an app in Western Australia which is on cell phones. So it was a PhD project, and they developed this app, and you can download it onto your cell phone for free, and you can use it to identify materials and also to assess their state, whether you need to do something about it or not. And it's important to have a backup for this. So if the person is worried but isn't sure, they need to be able to contact somebody to give them some advice about it. And Paul mentioned this, and honestly, this is so important. There must be affordable and accessible disposal sites. At the moment, you have to take the asbestos-containing material to a specialized waste site. You have to get it there, and then you have to find a site, and then it costs a lot of money, and that's difficult. And people won't do it, and they're going to just throw the stuff into the veld. And that's not a uniquely South African problem. It happens all over, that people, they don't know what to do with the material, so they just dump it somewhere. Next slide, please. Yeah, so, I mean, there are quite a lot of guides and information about communicating with the public about asbestos risk. Next slide, please. I think I'm coming to the end. Okay, well, Paul did mention that there's a lot of work being undertaken to document the extent of asbestos-containing materials at the municipal level and district level. So maybe this is happening, but I was thinking of limited surveys more to assess the weathering of the asbestos cement materials, especially roofs. I mean, we expect some weathering, but what's actually happening? Is there a lot of weathering? How important is the problem? So I think it would be useful to have some surveys like this. Next slide. I think it's the last one. Yep, that's the last one. Okay. Thanks, Shada.
Stop sharing. Thanks, David. Open to questions. So there's a question from Shireen. What is your knowledge experience regarding asbestos water tanks? An example would be in an apartment block where the main City of Cape Town water supply is pumped up to the tanks and then gravity fed to the individual units in the building, with no separation of water from the tanks or water used in the units coming from the tanks. David or Paul?
Maybe I can start. I used to teach that asbestos in water is just like having a high fiber diet. It could be good for you. That was facetious, by the way. But there was an article published last year suggesting that there might be a risk from ingested asbestos fibers. But let's say the conventional wisdom is that it's not a risk, having asbestos in water, in drinking water. And that's still my view, but I'm just mentioning that there is a contrary view.
Thanks, David. There's a comment from Leslie. Interesting that Saldanha has such a high concentration of asbestos homes, and that maybe that's the place to pilot it. Paul, I don't know if you want to comment on that, because I think you presented the information on the distribution of affected areas.
Sure. No, I have no comments on that. I mean, I also was surprised. Yeah, I haven't really gone into how this list was put together. So I probably need to ask around the department. But yeah, I'm not exactly sure why. It's I mean, might have to do with sort of the kind of industry that has existed there over time, and perhaps the sort of naval military presence there. I'm really not sure. I'm just grasping at things here, but I will investigate more. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul. Leslie, go ahead.
So Saldanha is also a place where there's a whole community focus on manganese, on on the rail tracked in ore. So there's probably quite a heightened awareness in Saldanha about metals in the environment, and community itself might be quite well sort of disposed or prepared. It might be a bad thing, but it's certainly an area I think where there'll be a lot of attention and interest.
Thanks, Leslie. Any other questions? So I have a question. Maria, go ahead. Go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Prof, and thanks for the presentations. Very interesting. As a resident of a home that does have asbestos roofs, I do have that personal experience of finding out, okay, how much is this going to cost? What are the options? Encapsulation versus removal. What was interesting for me was that of the quotes that we received, 30% of the cost was attributed to the mandatory air quality monitoring to be done by a private environmental hygiene company. So if government is intending to facilitate, these removals at mass, would that kind of capacity, that function, not to be better suited to be done, by a government entity itself, as opposed to getting the private sector in, because I think it is quite lucrative for them. And I'm just wondering whether there has been thought placed in terms of creating that capacity in-house in government. And then also to the cost of these type of removals is also the cost of, alternative accommodation for the persons while their home is undergoing these renovations. And I would imagine that to be all the more important considering the sector of society whose homes would be most affected. And my last point was really to say, since we don't yet know what is the state of these asbestos roofs that were installed many decades ago, would it be useful to have that as a prerequisite at the time of sale of a residential building? Because to my knowledge, things like an electricity compliance certificate or a beetle compliance certificate are all regulated as requirements when you're selling a home. Should it perhaps be regulated that if you have a home that has asbestos, you do need to report on the state of it at the time when you're doing a sale? Thanks.
Thanks, Maria. Paul, because much of it deals with regulation, I was wondering if you'd like to have a go at answering.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of government's capacity to do some kind of overall assessment, if I understand the question correctly, on things like the health condition or the air pollution or whatever, the amount of asbestos in the air and that kind of thing. I mean, from the health. I mean, this intervention is from the Human Settlements Department. So like in this case, there is quite a siloed sort of approach. And I mean, the points that David was raising about an overall policy, and within that policy, there is a place for like non-occupational or residence-based abatement or residence-located abatement. I mean, I think that does seem to make a lot of sense, but it's not what's happened. So because, I mean, they have been informed by environmental affairs and by the occupational health and all that, but there's no overall policy. And also I don't think that there's no capacity within government within the human settlement sector definitely to do this type of assessment, which is why they've identified all these contractors and bodies to undergo to do the kind of condition assessments and that kind of thing that's required before you go and do a project. It's all outsourced, and I mean I would think that as I raised the issue of like a conflict of interest, I think there is a huge risk of that. So some kind of oversight and some kind of assessment by a non-interested party, I think would be very important. But I don't know how that could be constructed in this environment that we're in now. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, the horse might have already bolted. That's what I'm worried about in terms of this policy and this intervention. There are already a whole lot of provinces that are doing this. It's very emotive, and so it's like how to manage that, how to manage expectations and emotions, in a very politicized environment. So I don't think it's going to be easy. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, I'm just rambling, but I'll shut up for a moment. Thanks.
May I comment on this?
Yes, David, go ahead.
Maria, so are you saying there was a requirement that somebody comes in and measures environmental asbestos fiber levels during or after the removal process?
That is what was communicated by a few contractors that we've asked quotes from. So they said that is a mandatory requirement, and that actual monitoring constituted 30% or more of the total quotes. So I don't know if that is a misrepresentation, but that's just my first-hand experience that I can report on. Yeah.
I can't imagine that it's a requirement, but if it is, the reason I wanted to say something is if it's going to work, the policy and the implementation and the actions have to be pragmatic. There's no point in measuring, well, to my mind, the environmental levels during and after removal. You have to do that in workplaces, and maybe they're just extrapolating from the Occupational Health and Safety Act. But I can't see how, I mean, it's just not pragmatic. I mean, asbestos fibers come from all over the place. If you're near a main road, for example, you're going to have asbestos. Well, I don't think that many breaks have asbestos in them anymore. But anyway, the point is there are other sources of asbestos. And anyway, what's an unsafe level? I don't think do people know what an unsafe level is? What are you going to do? What if you find asbestos fibers afterwards? What are you going to do? And what is the level what's the action level? I don't think anybody knows.
Thanks, David. I see Leslie says he thinks they're just taking a chance. I think there was another hand up, Kevin, I think. Do you want to pose your question?
Hi there. Thanks. It's not so much of a question, just a comment on that. I think environmental monitoring of asbestos, I've never really heard of that before and after a project. I don't know, did they maybe mean a form of clearance monitoring? So that's a monitoring that they do indoors after a removal has taken place, and that's just to stipulate whether the area is clear to re-enter. But in terms of environmental monitoring like that, that sounds very perplexing to me. It does sound like a bit of a chance taking. I used to work in consultancy when we did monitoring like that, but I've never once been required to do a form of environmental monitoring. In the nature of these particles, you'd be lucky to get the exact ones that were released during the removal once they do dissipate in the air because of the gravity, basically, their constituents. They'll almost dissipate into the air 20 kilometers down the road before you know it. It's a little bit perplexing to me.
Thanks for that, Maria. I hope that's cleared things up for you. There's another question from Leslie in the chat. To what extent does mine exposure accelerate progression to mesothelioma if an ex-miner lives in a house with an asbestos roof? David, maybe for you.
It's not Leslie Sinseki. We're sitting in the seminar room together. Thanks.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no, I understand. Sorry, I should have included my name. So I used to work in a cytology laboratory and in Amtata. So, I mean, we were a referral center for areas around that, I mean, where, you know, ex-miners really would be consulting, presenting with mesothelioma. And so it was not rare to find that. I can't remember. This is now more than 25 years ago. But it was not a rare finding, you know, to come up with that diagnosis. So, which is why now I'm wondering to what extent does that previous exposure influence the progression if one is also living in a house that has an asbestos roof.
David, do you want to respond?
Thanks.
Well, an asbestos cement roof is a trivial risk if the roof is not in too poor shape and you're not cutting it and grinding it and sanding it and things like that. So it's not going to contribute much relative to mining. But having said that, it is cumulative exposure that determines risk to some extent, not so much for mesothelioma, but for the other diseases. But I think it's a trivial contribution given the intensity of exposure in mining.
Thanks, David. I have one question. I wanted to know, you suggested the idea of selected surveys looking at the state of the roofs and trying to really ascertain the risk of exposure. From that, if I understood you correctly, has that sort of work been done in any way?
I'm not sure. That was what the Free State survey was supposed to be, but of course the money was never reached its intended actions. But to my knowledge, it hasn't been done. Paul might know better. But you know, my reason for suggesting it is that it could inform long-term planning. So let's say the weathering to the extent that fibers are likely to be liberated to a significant degree is found to be low, then you can plan longer term to do something about it. So that was my thinking behind it, because at the moment there seems to be a rush, you know, to do things, as Paul mentioned, and it might be absolutely inappropriate, and I think it probably is.
Paul, would you like to comment?
Yes, I mean, David raises a very important point, I think, and an opportunity maybe, because these, I mean, I'd have to find out a lot more about what's actually going on in these provinces, if I have the time, because I'm balancing on many other different things, and it's quite difficult to actually find out what other human settlements departments are doing, even though I am in one. And I'm basically a non-threat to other officials in other departments. It's actually very difficult to find out what is going on in a level of detail. But there's the policy, which, as I said, is a draft policy, and it's not clear whether the spirit of the policy is being followed. I mean, it still needs to be finalized, but it does provide for like a condition assessment for any area where they think that there is a problem with this asbestos. I mean, with like building materials. So but so like the nature of those assessments is not very clear, and there's no provision around that. But I would imagine that it's in some cases it would generate important information that, if it was captured, could be useful to provide an evidence base. So that's maybe something that can be put into the policy, although you have to specify a lot more about what you need to do to make that useful. So, I mean, it's to establish the link between a kind of the condition of a roof and and fibers in the atmosphere, I would imagine could be quite difficult. But I mean, if there's already an existing a kind of evidence, if that's already been done, and you can just infer from the state of the asbestos, then it could be incredibly useful to do a kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Like to extract some value from these surveys at a high level. Yeah. So I mean, I think that is an interesting avenue to explore for sure. Thanks.
Thanks, Paul. I just wanted to ask before we finish off, we've sort of run out of time and we're already 10 minutes over time. I wanted to ask, these draft regulations, are they still open for comment? Or, I mean, can the public and other interested parties or stakeholders comment on them?
No, is the answer. It's all takes place sort of in-house within the kind of policy environment. So unfortunately, there aren't regulations, they're policy around a program, and there's no real consultation around these except to government officials, sort of within the within the government, and then eventually it will be published in the housing code, and then it's kind of like too late. So yeah, it may be necessary to do a kind of something at an intervention at a high level in terms of a proper white paper or green paper or whatever on what David was suggesting, an overall policy on abatement, with the necessary kind of de-escalatory sort of language kind of embedded in that, and caution around moving too fast, because you don't want that to provoke even further acceleration on a path that may not be necessary. Yeah, anyway, thanks.
Thanks, Paul. I'm going to allow one more question. Pamela, you can pose your question.
It's not a question, just to add on what Paul was saying. So as much as the policy itself won't be for public comments, won't be open for public comments, but there have been announcements made at national level of the existence of this asbestos program. And I just basically wanted to say nothing stops anyone else who's not in our space from, I don't know, writing a column or some kind of document to, if they are of the view that it needs to be opened up, or if they have a particular view about whether that's the right approach to having taken consideration of, for example, David's key question around whether is this what you would want to, in a context where there's a shortage of money and all we're tapping into the same port, basically, is this where you would want to spend your money versus other priorities in the country? So I just wanted to say nothing stops people from using other avenues of advocacy also to question or add on to the debate. Thanks.
Thanks, Pamela. I think that's a sort of fitting point to stop. I wish to thank David and Paul for the really interesting presentations. I think it's raised more questions and given us answers, but I think it is something that we're all going to have to continue thinking about going into the future. I think both in terms of the challenges that the ongoing legacy of asbestos poses, and how do we engage with those risks and allocate the resources effectively. So thank you everyone for a very interesting noon meeting. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.